What's going on, 3DMJers? We're back with another episode of the podcast. Today I am joined by head coaches Alberto Nunez and Brian Miner, and we're going to be discussing specificity in powerlifting. This is kind of a cool topic because it bounces around, and anyone who's been around the powerlifting game for more than, I'm even going to say something like 5 years, not even something like a decade, we'll see this pendulum kind of shift. And we'll go through periods where we'll be more into just doing the big three themselves or using more accessory movements. And even the definition of what is an accessory or what's an assistant movement differs from coach to coach. Initially, a lot of this came from just the heavy influence of multiply and the challenge of actually getting into your equipment. If we went back all the way to the mid-2000s, we were heavily influenced by the West Side crew, mostly multiply lifters, mostly super heavy multiply enhanced lifters to be really specific. And we saw a lot of information that was quote unquote geared towards that type of person. That pun is there for you. And I think that influenced the accessory decisions. And we saw a lot of things like reverse hypers. We saw things like good mornings, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're in the era of the dominance of raw, unequipped lifting. And heck, most people these years who are new to the game, your juniors, your sub-juniors, they may never have actually seen an equipped meet or even a meet where there are equipped lifters at it, depending on the country they're in. But even within the raw community, you'll see divergence on this topic, and it's shifting over time. So essentially what we're going to discuss is, hey, if all a powerlifter does is get on the platform and do a heavy squat, bench, or deadlift, then why would they need to do anything else if specificity is king? And the principle of specificity is one of those main things that we need to pay heed to as the tenets of exercise principles and programming. So first, I'm going to kick it off to you, Brian. Where do you sit on the specificity spectrum, and how do you conceptualize this?
I like to think of specificity is first, just within the context of what time frame you're looking at. So powerlifting, like game day, it's only the big three. But when we look at the adaptations that we need to express strength on game day, what's most specific to that, to those multiple adaptations can be different. So something like for example, let's say there was a powerlifter who had underdeveloped quads, and then that was clearly their musculature was a limiting factor, and they're focused, say it's early in their training career, earlier in their doing hack squats. That could be far from, specific on the, compared to a barbell back squat on comp day, but it could be highly specific for the training stimulus and the objective they're trying to achieve within that, which I think is ultimately kind of how I conceptualize periodization. It's just different phases of specificity that is, being combined to make performance, most specific to the trait that you're expressing in the sport that you're doing.
And I love it. That adds some really good depth to where we're thinking about specificity temporally now. Obviously, when we're about to get on the platform, then we need to be good at what we're going to do on the platform. But then the question is, well, how long does it take to develop that skill? How much practice do we need? And what are all the things that go into strength? And like you said, some of those qualities are not well built with just simply doing heavy singles on the big three. The example of a hack squat is a good one. So now we've layered in this thing that probably most people on the podcast are not going to be surprised by, that muscle size is going to be a contributor to strength. So we need to think about what's the best way to build muscle. Now, Alberto, you're a powerlifting coach, but you're also a bodybuilding coach. And I bring that up because it's easily to see in bodybuilding that your limb lengths, your proportions, your heritability as far as your own shape is probably the biggest determinant of your success in the sport. You've probably also noticed trends in powerlifting, that is absolutely the same. So have you found that movement selection is something that some people get the privilege of not having to think much about in powerlifting, while others really do have to consider some of these other factors and other methods of training the prime movers in the squat, bench, and deadlift?
Yeah, it's crazy because people assume like the FFMI, the going over 25 screams like not natty. It's like, to me, it's if you have the right bone structure, like that is the thing that is going to like have you being accused of that, like whether it's bodybuilding or powerlifting. Like I'm a relatively small frame guy. I'd estimate that a third of all healthy males can put on more lean body mass than me, but it's going to look vastly different because of what my humerus relative to my forearm and just the way everything sits on top of each other. With powerlifting, yeah, like that is how people. I was having this discussion with an athlete just on how low your glute attaches. Like that is going to completely change like the force output. Same thing with pecs. I think with pecs, it's like very obvious, right? Where, not just limb lengths, but, like that, what was it? The slingshot that they were selling. Like it gave everyone like these like silverback pecs basically is what it did. So yes. So aside from like the clear advantage when it comes to getting stronger, if you have a setup where you have a very long torso, short femurs, like you're probably not going to need a whole lot of assistance work for your quads because they're always going to, be in the line of fire. Like especially think now that I think we've had a few goes at this now with the whole lengthened positions and then how that is important for hypertrophy. Like when you see someone who's built like that, it's like, dude, those quads are getting soaked like 3 times a week. So yeah, a lot of the people who get jacked from just powerlifting, their threshold to meet the requirements for hypertrophy is just in general lower than most. And then based on their setup, like more than ever now, like it makes sense to me why I never thought my chest was weak. Like it's just because it structurally looks all right, but it's weak because of the rib cage it sits on. Whereas like someone like Brian, his rib cage is like angled like this. So like his big pec fibers are like right in the line of fire, and a bench press is like certainly all he needs. Whereas for me, like to get big pecs like Brian, and this would be important if I want to bench press, it's like maybe I need to find something that angles me in that direction. Like I've always had better pec growth from dips than like anything else. And in turn, that's going to make me a better bench presser. So yeah, you have to pay attention to how your body moves through space. Like when it comes to these big 3 movements, regardless of like what's in the line of fire, like there's prime movers that need to be addressed for the sake of sports specificity. And it's knowing how to scratch those places that it's in your best interest. If you're not one of those people who are just blessed and they just fall in the right positions from doing the big 3.
Yeah, it's something that I think the lengthened partials or the training at a long muscle length is acutely useful to understand here. Because I think before we had that understanding that a muscle being at a relatively longer length while being exposed to tension had a large impact on the amount of hypertrophy you'd get out of a given movement, I might have had the perspective of, well, look, if they're doing the big 3 and a given muscle is underdeveloped, they're probably not using it very much in that movement. But that's probably actually not true in some cases, because your muscles can produce a lot of force at various joint angles. Like you could use the quads as an example and take them through various degrees of knee extension, and they're going to be producing a substantial amount of force at most of those degrees, and many of them are expressed in a squat. But if you're built in such a way that you don't ever get the quads in a really big stretch and you're doing a massive good morning, they're contributing a lot of force, but they might not be getting much of a growth stimulus. So then the question is, okay, what do I do to make these bigger so they can contribute more force? And then down the line, hopefully that investment pays off. And Berto, what you essentially kind of opened up there was a really good discussion of how some people are built in such a way so that the squat, bench, and deadlift are excellent vehicles for growing them. And when that also converges with a resilience to injury and not experiencing too much joint and soft tissue stress from doing high volumes of those, you get the person who responds very well and very favorably to a highly specific powerlifting program. So with those two things kind of established, we understand individual biomechanics, individual limb lengths, and the relative proportions of them, and the impact on how well the squat, bench, and deadlift stimulate you. And we also talked to Brian to get his perspective. We're getting some things shaking out here that, hey, we have to think about muscle growth. And there are times for certain people that the big three are not great vehicles for that. So what do we do? I would also like to take a bit of a detour here, and because this is a bodybuilding and powerlifting podcast, so I think a lot of people understand the importance of having bigger muscles and strength, and say that, hey, it might even go beyond that, because I don't think most people have a really grounded and complete understanding of what specificity even is. I want to give a shout out to Mike T briefly, but he's brought this up as just kind of a question. What's more specific? A max pin squat or a competition squat, but at 80% of 1RM for a single? And the answer is not clear. That's not a gotcha. That's just saying, hey, look, they both have different aspects of the same specificity continuum. We have movement specificity, and we also have load specificity. And, us humans, kind of dumb, in my opinion. So anytime there's more than one thing interacting, we seek a simplified, unified answer to it. So when most people say the word specificity, they're thinking of one or the other, and they have trouble layering those things together. So I've seen some hilarious decisions from people who are heavily in the specificity camp, putting on their belt, their knee sleeves, and doing warm-ups on the bar while wearing both because it's highly specific, while forgetting the fact that they're only lifting 20 kilos and their max is 220 kilos, and thinking, hey, this is nothing like a 1RM back squat. You're getting nothing out of this slight incremental increase in specificity because it's just a completely different movement when you're lifting that light of a weight, the velocity that you can move it at. So anyway, I think it's important for us just to remember that specificity encompasses a lot of things. Joint angles, the actual requirements of how much force you're putting out. Yes, the actual position you get to in space, the things you think about, the level of arousal you need to get to, how much you even need to give attention to actually bracing. It feels a lot different to get ready to do a set of 15 high bar squats where you're not fully locking out as kind of like a bodybuilder, emulating, the Tom Platz video versus doing a single at 8. So I wanted to just bring that over to you, Brian. When you think about specificity, what does all that encompass?
Basically, everything you just said is kind of what, there's, the coordination aspect, I think, is a big one when it comes to like that one sort of layers on top of specificity of load and specificity of the movement, itself. Like I don't think doing like a 1RM hack squat, even though like I wouldn't say that's more specific to a back squat than like a 10RM hack squat necessarily, because the objective of what we're trying to get out of it's completely different. Like the way I look at each like exercise within a powerlifting program is like what specific trait are we trying to develop here? And whether it's hypertrophy within a single muscle group, strength within a sort of an isolated group of muscles, that can radically change kind of the approach, and depending on the individual, and kind of where they're at on that continuum, like you said, limb lengths play a big role, but I think ultimately for powerlifters, one thing I've noticed is, I've gotten older, like the arousal level of doing like highly specific heavy loading, like that is something that I'm glad you touched on, because it's like you want to know how to tap into that when you need to on meet day, but you also don't want every single training day to be like an emotional battle, and so there's that aspect too. And it doesn't need to be, if you're focused on hypertrophy, then you don't need to be doing 1RM squats. And kind of the analogy I like to use, to mirror this with bodybuilding, it's like if your estimated max, like 6 months out from a meet, is down because you're like in a developmental phase focused on hypertrophy, and that's like setting off the alarm bells for you because you're not as strong as maybe you were 3 months prior when your last meet was or whatever. It's kind of like a bodybuilder who's concerned that they don't have shredded abs in the middle of an off season. That's not the objective at this point in time. And so I think when it comes to these different traits that we're trying to develop, there's like, I like to always kind of keep a pulse on each one, but just the allocation of our resources, just, if we're in a developmental block, it's like maybe we include, some moderately heavy top sets just to keep that familiarity with it. But the bulk of our volume, whether that's a back squat for somebody who's well, suited for that, or, a hack squat, leg press, whatever, that's going to carry more of the workload for the trait that we're trying to develop.
Really good insights, Brian. I really like how you brought up the angle on specificity, that we are trying to get a specific outcome. And I think that's a really excellent way of turning specificity on its head that has a lot of use in application. Specificity should be seen as what I'm trying to achieve. I'm trying to achieve something specific. It is not a written in stone thing that is external to you that you must adhere to. Because you guys just had a great chat about this 2 episodes ago in episode 230 in the Q&A when you had a question about grip strength. Most people, if you showed them a picture of someone, or a video, I should say, of someone holding on to a bar for time to train their grip, and someone doing a max deadlift, and you ask them which one is more specific to a powerlifting deadlift, you'd say, oh, the deadlift. But I can guarantee you that for someone who's limiting factor for what is going to, put more kilos on their deadlift in 3 weeks or 4 weeks, if it's their grip, more deadlifts aren't going to get the job done, because it's actually less than the amount of force output that would be specific to them actually doing a 1RM, right? So there are elements here that I think really need to be paid attention to. Instead of looking at specificity of the whole thing together, what's the lowest hanging fruit or the shortest pathway to get to an outcome based upon what might be lagging? And this is something that I think Westside actually had right. What's the weakest link in the chain, and how do we train that, and how do we bring it up? And I think one of the easiest examples is something like grip strength, because just hammering away and doing more and more deadlifts is not the trade-off is absolutely not worth it. And I think that is something that's worth discussing as well, is that there is as some people might say, the stimulus to fatigue ratio, which is, I don't think it's a perfect concept, but it's really helpful here. Doing heavy squats, bench, and deadlifts takes a high arousal state. It's a high risk, high reward movement. It takes a lot of time. And if you can achieve something that is similar to one of those, and sometimes even better, something that doesn't take as much time or effort or energy, that can be a huge benefit to your programming. So I think that's something to understand, is that the math is not as straightforward as sometimes people make it out to be in these specificity conversations. The typical, I don't want to keep straw manning this typical, coach who is specificity focused, but I have heard people say, I look at the transfer, like how many units of this variation does it take to, be the equivalent to actually doing the movement? And I think that perspective is not 100% accurate because it always ends up being a better idea to just do the movement. The argument of, well, what's going to have, the most transfer to a squat? It's a squat. And then the question is, well, why would I ever do a pause squat? Why would I ever do a pause deadlift? Why would I ever do a deficit deadlift? Why would I ever do flat back bench? And I think from talking to you both, we can see there are times where it makes sense to do both. Like let's take the bench press again and go back to what Berto was discussing with being at longer muscle lengths and shorter muscle lengths. If you're really good at arching and you have a max legal grip bench press, you're not getting much stretch on your triceps, delts, or your pec. You are getting a larger bench press because you only have to move the bar, to the legal limit that the IPF allows for that to be, to depth now that rule is in place. But if you know that all those muscles need to be bigger to produce more force, that means you're going to need to do variations, say maybe feet up bench press, dumbbells, heck, incline, whatever, to where you can actually get those muscles into a position where they're more effectively trained. And again, that goes back to what you said, Brian, is there's a time component here. Yeah, when you're close to competition and you're going to be doing that arched wide grip bench press where you can lift the most weight, you need to practice that. But if you're 12 weeks out and you want to actually try to bring up those muscles and you came off the peaking blocks, you're nice and sensitive to volume and you're sensitive to actually being able to stimulate muscle growth because you've been focusing more on the technical side, this is a great opportunity for you to do a fair amount of pressing with a lot of variety where you're getting a little more range and really tapping into those muscles that are not well stimulated by the bench press itself. What's going on, everybody? Eric Helms here, Chief Science Officer of 3DMJ. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and let me just take 1 second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I do with Lauren Colenso-Semple, Eric Trexler, as well as Mike Zerdos. These are experts in their field, and we cover all the information relevant to you as an athlete or coach if you're working with strength or physique athletes, or if you're a recreational or competitive athlete yourself. We cover nutrition, training, sports psychology, and health. And we do this in written format, as well as, since you like the podcast, audio summaries, as well as video concept reviews. If you're a trainer, we also have continuing education credits for ACSM, NSCA, NASM, and ACE. So head over to 3dmusclejourney.com, click on the products tab, and you can find us there. I look forward to seeing you and enjoy the podcast. Berto, when you think about the dosing and the how much you give and at what time, like Brian was talking about, what are some of the factors that go into your head with how long I want to stick with being a little more hypertrophy focused? How long do I want to stick with being more focused on singles or heavy lifts? And how do I break that down across, one or more competitions?
All right. So when we talk about specificity, like, it's like you could take like the nature's example of like this giraffe just makes sense to live here, right? And obviously we don't have time for that shit, but you can see how that works out. And it works the same way with sports. Like these are the sports. This is like what is required for you to be successful in this specific game. And there's certain athletes that just don't have to train to make up for their physical deficiencies nearly as much. They could just focus on skill almost. Like you take LeBron James at like 14 years of age, like just physically, this boy was superior than like 99.9% of like full grown men. Don't worry about his athleticism. Teach him to dribble, teach him to shoot, teach him to understand the game. So when I think of specificity, like it goes back to like fuck the giraffes. They're going to get their food. How are we going to get your food, right? How are we going to figure this out for you? How are you going to find success in this game? And that's going to vary a lot from person to person. Like going from LeBron James to like go to your random like varsity basketball game somewhere. And you see all sorts of physiques out there that you're like, fuck, bro. Like if you just lost like 20% of your body weight, you'd be such a better basketball player. Like it's super obvious with amateurs, right? So how much time we spent there, honestly, depends on the situation and like what that athlete needs. Because to me, specificity when dealing with someone one-on-one, so it's you, your coach, or you with yourself, it's like, all right, what do I need so that I can come well prepared and I can pass as whatever I'm trying to pass as? So for some people, like, damn, it can just be like, just main lifts once a week because we got to get a lot of weight off you just so your system functions. And this, I'm making it very obvious, functions well. And then, we'll work on like muscle building and coordination. Like there's certain people that you'll see them perform a movement. You're like, fuck, I've never seen in all my years someone mess up a squat that way. Like, what was that? So, yeah, it all goes back to like what you need and how much time like you need there. I can think of like, I guess, yeah, guys that are much more advanced, like, and obviously they fit them all. They got things going for them, but they spend most of their time like just honing the skill for the most part. They have as much muscle as they'll ever need. Right. So yeah, it just depends on what you need, man. Because for some people it might be like, bro, like you're, I don't know, 350 pounds and you could squat 700 pounds. But like, bro, I'm sure if like we gave you like 90 minutes of zone 2 cardio and worked up to that, like it can't be that bad. Like you would be a better powerlifter. So it goes back to like what the athlete needs. Like there's some guys that are technically amazing. I used to know a great squatter back in the day, and I'll say his name because he'll enjoy it. His name was Roy Ha. And I would look at this kid squat and I'm like, bro, like on those legs, on like that spine, you're technically so gifted, but like, dude, like we need to build up those areas. So yeah, it goes back to like what the athlete needs. It's just like with my bodybuilders. With some of them, it's like, man, we got to work on your mentals. Like, and when it involves food in the off season, like that's what do you need? So it goes back to that, so that we can pass as whatever we're trying to pass as, like giraffe, Salisbury steak, whatever.
I love it. I love the analogies. And I think now you guys have both brought up two different ways of looking at specificity that are incredibly important, and probably more important than thinking of it as this big picture concept and overwhelming principle that kind of changes the rules of everything else. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. Berto, you just talked about specificity should be specific to the individual. That's the application of specificity. And Brian, earlier you discussed that specificity should be for a specific outcome. And I think that's a very different perspective than principle of specificity. I need to, play like I practice and practice like I play. And if my sport is the big three, then I should be doing the big three. And even more so, if my sport is the big three for a max, then I need to be doing heavy squat, bench, and deadlift every time I train.
You think one of these guys ever brought a belt to like their bedroom? Like just one, like it's like I've seen it like get pretty bad. That's yeah. Carry on.
No, I mean, absolutely. No. I fantastic imagery. I think we're all better for it. So thank you. Valsalva, you could see being helpful in that scenario. You do get pretty sweaty, and other things can get on things. So I think that might increase the number of times people search on Google, how do you insert bodily fluid out of leather belt? But we'll leave that to a different discussion. Or maybe never, but nonetheless, I think absolutely.
Do you think they ever chalk up?
I mean, you'd have to be. I don't know. That's a tough one, because certain areas you do want to have stability, and you want to be able to, make sure that you can move the way you need to. But other areas, you absolutely don't.
It's a mixture of baby powder and chalk. Yeah,
and don't mix them up. Just like on the platform, All right. We should cut all that out for you, dear listener. But since you just listened to it, we didn't. So you're welcome. Where was I? Yes. Before we got into the use of powerlifting accoutrement in the bedroom, I think I was discussing that specificity should be seen as what is specific to the individual and what is the specific adaptation trying to get that will contribute the most in the most efficient way with the least amount of fatigue to the outcome you want. We've also established that hypertrophy is very important, just having bigger muscles. And I think these are all very logical ways of looking at how specificity can be viewed in a more nuanced way, in a more utilitarian way, and applied to coaching. But I think sometimes it's not even that obvious why specificity is not necessarily the best and only way to approach things. For everyone who just absolutely loves their exercise science and they read the specificity principle, I think it's important to also think about how it interacts with other principles of training. So, for example, there's a motor learning principle, sometimes characterized as a principle, or sometimes characterized as a method, called varied practice. And if you were to ever take a graduate level course in motor learning, or even sometimes undergraduate, you come across this, and it almost seems in polar opposition to the principle of specificity. Because varied practice is basically saying that by having different types of the same skill interspersed with one another, you will learn a skill faster than by simply practicing the exact skill that you're trying to get better at. So, for example, let's use dart throwing. And this has literally been studied multiple times, dart throwing. If you know that you need to stand on a line and you're trying to throw for a bullseye, you will get better with the same number of hours of practice having some type of varied or even random variation in how far you stand away from the dartboard, being a foot closer or a foot away, than always standing at that one position throwing at the dartboard. Now, the question you might ask is, well, why? And part of it seems to have to do with calibration. If you think about our bodies or our ability to gauge where our body is in space, we need more points to quote unquote triangulate where we are. So if we know that when we're close, we need to not throw as hard to get the same arc and hit that target, and when we're farther away, we have to throw harder, that helps our brain solidify the motor pattern of being in that spot that's right where you're supposed to be. Now, if you think about this even further, you can probably extrapolate and understand that this approach to motor learning is probably even more important in what we would call an open sport or an open task, meaning that we have a dynamic environment. So, for example, basketball, team sports, anything where the environment is changing, where you might have to be really good at cutting, but you don't just cut at a predetermined time. You cut in response to an opponent or in response to which way you see a football flying through the air. In powerlifting, you might argue, well, hey, that's not really a thing. It's always an Alico rack. It's always calibrated plates. I'm always wearing my knee sleeves, belt, etc., yada, yada, yada. And to some degree, that's true. But like I said, dart throwing is an example of a relatively closed skill. And there are multiple examples of this. So varied practice, the other thing it leverages is what's called contextual interference. You guys remember Shiko? How you squat and then you bench and then what do? You squat again? This is actually one version of contextual interference. Contextual interference simply states that when you're trying to learn a task and then you go away from it and do something completely different, that it forces you to forget a little bit of what was in your immediate memory to do that other task. So, for example, they've done studies where you lift weights and then you read a book, or you throw darts, as another example. It's easy to test throwing darts. We love that in exercise science, apparently. And then you go back to lifting weights. All of a sudden, your brain is going, wait. I thought we were done with lifting weights. We were throwing darts. I forgot about your bench setup. And the actual act of trying to remember setting up on your bench press more efficiently and in a faster way makes those solidified neural patterns become a thing, and your motor learning speed improves. So it doesn't necessarily require you to do variations on the main lifts, a la, West Side, but you can do this with a highly quote-unquote specific approach where you do squat, bench, and then squat, for example. Or hell, you could do it with squat, read Harry Potter and squat if you want. It doesn't even actually require an exercise, although I don't recommend Harry Potter. Terrible book. Yeah, that's right. I'm old. I like Tolkien. Suck it, millennials. So anyway, moving along. Now that I've alienated most of our listeners under the age of 40, and I've broken Andrea's heart while she's sitting here trying to control herself. But anyway, in all seriousness, that is something that I think has been unintentionally leveraged by many various coaches over the years. If you think about West Side, okay, this week we're going to do a max squat. Next week we're going to do a pause squat. Next week we're going to do a box squat. And next week we're going to do a good morning. They're all variations on a similar movement, but they're all requiring you to think back to and find the connections between and remember these things so that you can maintain a skill, and it may actually be more efficient. Now, the one caveat I will give is there's not a ton of research on this in the realm of lifting, but there's not no research on this. There's a classic study by Fonseca and colleagues where they had untrained, which is an important point, lifters doing all of their volume on squats, and then lifters doing their volume split between 4 different exercises: leg press, deadlift, lunges, and squats. And the squat 1RM actually went up more in the groups that were varying their volume between those 4 movements. And there's a few other examples as well, but I think the point is that that's not something that would be immediately intuitive, because we often think of strength in terms of physical capacities, right? We've been talking a lot about muscle size contributing to strength, but Brian was talking about all of the different things that contribute to strength. And Berto was talking about how certain lifters seem to exemplify one or more of those qualities. You get the guy who's been a bodybuilder and a bro lifter for years, and he comes to the sport of powerlifting and is just doing everything wrong technically. You probably don't need to spend much time on training for muscle size, just enough to maintain it, while you focus heavily on skill development. And the opposite could be true for someone who just maybe took squat in university a little too much to heart, and every time they had any variation in technique, they dropped it back down to the bar, and they have a beautiful squat, but they really don't have any legs, like you were mentioning. So that kind of dichotomy can show you that you need to emphasize these things. But ultimately, strength is a skill. Yes, that skill's maximum magnitude that you can put on the bar, your maximum strength, is heavily influenced by your physiological characteristics, but motor learning and skill development should be part of it. So I think it's important to understand that. And understanding that strength is a skill could be an argument for or against a highly specific approach. But if you don't understand all of the different principles that go into our understanding of exercise science, like varied practice and the way motor learning works, then you could very easily neglect probably the most efficient path. I will say that DUP, daily undulating periodization, is another way to leverage contextual interference, because every time you step in the weight room to do a variation on the squat, bench, or deadlift, even if you're using kind of the 1.0 version of this, where it's always the competition squat, bench, or deadlift, it's a different rep range. So there's many ways to vary the practice, and they probably all accomplish the same thing. And this is one of those great opportunities where it's dealer's choice, If I want to get better at squatting, better at benching, and better at deadlifting, and I need to look at the individual characteristics that I have, like Berto brought up, I actually would benefit from having a little more size. Let me train higher reps on one of those days. I can leverage varied practice and get some volume in. Or like Brian said, hey, I need to leverage varied practice, or I'd like to leverage varied practice, but I also need to get some specific outcomes. So, if my grip strength is an issue, well, on one of these days, I'm just going to hold the top of my last rep, regardless of the rep scheme, for as long as I can for time, and try to increase that time as a method of also adding that stimulus. And I think the final thing I will say on this, and I'll let you guys chime in however you'd like, is that it also starts to give a little more of a understanding of why you might use certain variations when you think of lifting as a skill. So there was a period where people did pause squats because people said pause squats were good. There's a period of time people said, let's do box squats because box squats are good, or pause deadlifts. And just kind of doing it because they were the hot accessory and this strong person or this coach used them a lot. But if you actually talk to those coaches who originated those approaches, they typically tell you they're trying to solve a specific problem. So a very common thing that you'll see in the deadlift, and I've used this example before, is that sometimes people will let the bar drift away from their shin and they'll lose it forward. And again, if we kind of use that analogy of triangulation and radar and needing to be aware of your body and space and in relation to the barbell, sometimes you just need more time and more exposure to do that. So pausing at mid-shin is essentially an opportunity to wait a second and go, do I feel the barbell on my shins? Rather than that tiny little loop that you barely notice because you're trying to exert max effort, keep your hips out, keep your air in, keep your back straight, try to look up, all these things, you lose track of whether the bar is on your shin or not. But by pausing, now all of a sudden you get an opportunity to notice that. You enhance your radar, and that can be something that transfers specifically to the person who misses deadlifts because the bar gets away from them, And now that variation is correcting a specific technical deviation rather than it just being seen as, yeah, bro, I heard this coach uses pause deadlifts. Let's throw them in without really much attentiveness to the specific needs of the individual in their motor learning journey. So anyway, I'm going to leave it at there. Gentlemen, anything else you guys want to add on this topic?
One thing, and this probably ties more into what Berto mentioned, being specific to each individual. One area that I've always kind of found interesting is the debate on like a novice lifter, like where would their time be best spent? If someone's never back squatted before, like, and they want to do a meet after a year of training or whatever, is it better for them to back squat, in the short term, and get really proficient at that? Like what is going to maximize, like if you had a brand new lifter who's never squatted before, they're going to compete in their first meet in 12 months. Like the debate on how to best structure their training there. And one thing that I see, and probably social media is probably responsible for a lot of this, but a lot of junior lifters that have, are new to the sport that really go far on that continuum when it comes to specificity. And in my opinion, a lot of them sort of age out to some degree of their like prime growth years, where they could really be putting on a lot of muscle and building that like muscular foundation and just trying to get by only with what's required to move the needle in terms of proficiency. So I've always sort of leaned more to the side of, let's get as jacked as we can early on in our training career and try to, keep, that, keep a squat, deadlift, bench in place, but focus on more developmental avenues. And then obviously muscle growth starts to slow, as we progress across our training careers. And then the flip side of that argument, or, on the other end of the spectrum with, more advanced lifters, like how do we best spend our time? Like if we're focused on, let's say, somebody's 98% of their muscular potential, or just arbitrary number, they've gains have come to a crawl at this point. How do we best invest our time in picking these accessories and allocating these different levels of specificity at that stage in a training career? And I still think there's benefits of these, sort of training like a bodybuilder a lot of the time. And it's not, at that point, it's less to do with muscular development. And I think some of it is to do like, okay, well, consider the alternative at this point. Like if we're already jacked and we're proficient in a movement, like how are we then going to train to increase our 1RM? And if it's okay, I'm just going to try to max out like neural avenues and coordination avenues of progressing, like that's a lot of high intensity work year round for that individual. So it's always been a topic where it's like, okay, the role of these movements can kind of change across a training career too. And it's, like when we look at all the different adaptations that go into the expression of strength, there's going to be points where it's harder to move the needle on any given one of those. But we also need to make sure that we're like, if we still have room to grow in one, that we're not, I think we have to be careful not to put all of our chips in that basket, because that can start to compromise like the longevity element of things. So yeah, I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of discussion that can be had with this topic. And, Eric, like you said, it's once people sort of understand what specificity really is, I think it makes it easier to look at different styles of programming and withhold judgment in some cases, because there's a lot, there's a lot of unique individuals out there that have different demands at different times. And, the squat, bench, and deadlift are probably always going to be, included within their programs to some capacity. But it's always been interesting to me, like what's the appropriate dose of that? And also like what's the minimum effective dose when it comes to like neurological adaptations and coordinated aspects of things. And that's going to vary person to person. You know, somebody with an extensive sport background, you know, it's like we've all coached lifters that pick things up very quickly. And, you know, there's people that get into weight training, you know, maybe didn't have any athletic experience early, you know, in their childhood. And it's a much like leaning into those movements might be more advantageous for those people because they just lack that proficiency. So I think there's a large canvas here, and I think it's just highly dependent on the person and the traits that they're trying to develop based on that.
Totally agree. And I'm really glad that you brought up the concept of dosing and kind of some of the archetype of the junior lifter who goes ham on a high volume of specificity because they want to be good now and they want to maximize it before they got to go to the open category.
Mm-hmm.
I think psychology comes into play there as well. And I think you do make a strong case for why it's important to include hypertrophy work. The other way to look at it for that same person who maybe is skeptical of changing the way they want to do it and the way they have seen others do it and be successful, at least in the short term, is, well, what's the most amount of time dedicated to specific work that you can actually benefit from? And that goes right back to dosing, like you said. And we actually have some interesting data on this. You know, we get a lot of positive messaging in bodybuilding in relation to volume. And there's a reason for that. You know, we have multiple meta-analyses that suggest that there's a relationship, a dose-response relationship with doing more work and getting more hypertrophy. It is a diminishing dose response, but it's a dose response. And you will see in both 2017 meta-analysis by Schoenfeld, going from 1 to 4 to 5 to 9 to 10 plus sets, as well as an updated one looking at higher volumes by Baz Val just a couple years back, going all the way to 20 plus. And, you know, that's kind of where our recommendation from the muscle and strength pyramids of 10 to 20 sets is kind of like your starting place that is probably going to cover most of the bell curve of most people for an appropriate volume. So I understand why people do a lot of volume of specific work. But what I think a lot of people forget is that volume relationship is much less clear for strength. There's a meta-analysis by Ralston that basically replicated the methods of Schoenfeld, done in 2017 as well. And while Schoenfeld saw this relatively clear response, and you get about 2/3 of your gains from doing 1 to 4 sets, 80-something% from doing 5 to 9, and the full 100% from doing 10 plus, in Ralston, they actually had to break it down into 2 categories because there was not much of a difference. And in fact, they had a range of 1 to 12 in the studies. And 5 to 12 sets produced a similar amount, and it was only like 15% more and non-significant and a trivial effect size more than doing 1 to 5 sets. So the drop-off, the diminishing returns from doing a ton of volume of higher intensity work for strength versus hypertrophy is a lot more steep. So that tells you something about what the minimum effective dose is. And it tells you what's the thing that's going to transfer the most to strength. And it is specific work. So in one way, this meta-analysis says, hey, specificity is king. If you just do, 1 to 5 heavy sets per week on a given movement, you've probably gotten the most out of it you can if you're kind of the average person in this meta-analysis, which of course you probably aren't, but it describes a lot of people. But on the other hand, it doesn't support the idea of, okay, specificity is king, let me just do a ton of it. And it actually supports what you're saying, Brian, of, hey, if I got a junior lifter, let me get in a couple singles with a couple of back-off sets per week. Boom, I've got my vast majority of my motor learning I can even get. And you know what's going to take some time and will respond more to volume is all of this work to try to accrue some more contractile tissue in this critical period early on in my career. And I don't have to do that on a squat, bench, and deadlift that is really going to beat me up emotionally, physically, spiritually, and make it very difficult for me to keep progressing and stay in the game, and also probably increases my risk of injury. So I think there is a lot of support for what you're saying, the minimum effective dose, and even not even the minimum effective, but a pretty damn good dose is a lot lower than we think it is. And I would encourage people to check out some of the work by Dr. Pack, who's actually taken powerlifters and experimented with different low volume, high intensity specific protocols and found that, hey, just simply doing somewhere between 3 to 9 heavy sets per week is enough to get gains that would be considered good by elite level powerlifters and powerlifting coaches in the vast majority of people. And those people who I'm talking about are actually national level powerlifters. So yeah, there's only so much specific practice you can benefit from, even though specificity is quote unquote king. And then you have to think, well, all right, then what's the most effective use of my time? And there's an opportunity for varied practice. There's an opportunity for bringing up underdeveloped muscles. There's an opportunity for using variations that don't beat up your joints. And there's an opportunity for thinking about the temporal programming aspect, where you might leverage a little more specificity closer to competition, but not be so worried about it when you're further away. Another interesting finding in Dr. Pack's work was that this highly specific approach was very effective for about 1 or 2 mesocycles, and then it starts to taper off. And that's probably exactly what Brian was getting to, in so much as there are multiple facets of the quality of strength. And if you are emphasizing one, sometimes just because of the opportunity cost, you're excluding others. And if you are doing that, then of course your strength is going to taper off because there's multiple components pushing it up. And if some are going up and other ones are going down, there's going to be a point where they cancel each other out, or it leads you to just kind of stagnating. So yeah, I think that that's all really well received, and hopefully I was able to provide some support to what you were suggesting, because I do agree.
Yeah, no, that was good. Yeah, with the more advanced athletes, I think the opportunity cost side is probably a better way to word it, because if you just go all in because you've maxed out, close to maxed out development, if you go all in on hyper specific movements, like eventually you're going to need to address the hypertrophy side again. So and as you said, there's diminishing returns with the high intensity work. So it's like, okay, well, if I'm not spending my time there, where should I be spending it? And I think when you look at the context of like across a full training career, it's like keeping somebody healthy, I think, is something that's often overlooked when looking at, when people are interpreting research, across like an 8 to 12 week study. Like you need to also consider like, okay, what about 8 to 12 months from now? Like what are things going to look like? So no, that was really good.
Yeah, I think longevity cannot be overlooked. And while it's very difficult to really study injury, because if you really want to understand causation and compare things, ideally you do a controlled trial. And causing injuries is something that's typically frowned upon in ethics, and injuries don't happen so frequently that we can just expect to observe a whole bunch of them in a small sample over an 8-week training study. However, when we look at data that compares different types of resistance training and different types of strength sport, we do see a differing number of injuries per 1,000 hours. And weightlifting, powerlifting, kind of generally falls between like 2 to 5 injuries per 1,000 training hours. Bodybuilding, however, typically is roughly half to a quarter of that, depending upon which study you're looking at. And that's not to say that powerlifting has a high injury rate. If you want to play basketball, you're doubling the injury rates of powerlifting, and that's true of most team sports. So powerlifting has a low injury rate, but bodybuilding's even lower. And you have to think about, like, why might that be? And it's bodybuilding, you're not restricted to specific movements. Bodybuilding, you're not restricted to specific repetition ranges. So you get the opportunity to train with various loads. You get the opportunity to say, ow, that hurts. Let me do something else, because I don't need to worry about the skill. I'm just trying to train the muscle. And I think there's something to be learned there from the more specific powerlifting community, is that you can still get useful skill development through some of the concepts we've talked about, varied practice, and do things that will enhance the overall quality of strength by having more variation, by using lighter loads for volume work on non-specific exercises if you need hypertrophy in a given muscle group, or by switching to a variation that, simply for the purpose of varied practice, and then the variation you choose is one that just doesn't beat your body up as much, because you can, and that's a useful strategy, and it might keep you in the game longer. So I think it's important. It's not like I can confidently say that the difference between powerlifting and bodybuilding is twofold, And I know exactly why, that it's load or exercise. It's probably a combination of all the factors and many of the traits that make up who powerlifters are, and the psychology and the environments they train in, and the nutrition and the emphasis on rest and all that stuff. It goes into it when we're comparing powerlifters to bodybuilders. But I think it would be foolish to say that it has nothing to do with the training of powerlifters and bodybuilders as to how often they get injured in training. So I think it is probably something we can leverage with some degree of confidence, that if we were to introduce more load variation and introduce more lift variation to do things like preserving our bodies, that we might be able to make it longer in the sport. And I think that is something that you have some anecdotal support for. There's a lot of masters powerlifters who come from an era, again, where equipped lifting was popular. And they like to switch between lifting in equipped and non-equipped, so raw or single ply in the IPF, for example, because they feel like that the equipment supports you in the phase of the given range of motion for the squat, bench, and deadlift, where you're typically accruing a lot of injuries from raw. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard interviews with high-level powerlifters who are M1s, M2s, and from an era where equipped lifting was still a thing, where they switch back and forth, or they started with equipment, and they find that when I'm beat up from raw, I go into equipped, and then I can recover but still compete and still get better, and I can come back, and then equipment beats me up in a unique way, and then I come back to raw. And they will attribute their longevity in the sport to that specifically, and I've heard that time and time again. And I think that is a nuanced and unique way of kind of talking about what I was suggesting, but it's an anecdote that has been repeated a lot in powerlifting. And I don't think everyone needs to go out and get a bench shirt, but I do think you can do the equivalent with, say, a bodybuilding approach. There's many ways to quote unquote periodize your training. If you need to focus on skill development as well as the actual morphological changes, you can make that a little more phasic, and you can individualize that based upon when am I jacked up? Like, when can I really just not bench that much? And then you can go, okay, well, what's the minimum amount I can bench so I can retain that skill? Because it doesn't take much, 1 to 5 sets on average. And then the rest of it, I can be doing things that my shoulders like, that my elbows like. And you can take that same analogy and apply it to the squat and deadlift variations. So I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that, but I find that as an essential component to staying in the game and having longevity as a powerlifter.
Yeah, those are all good points.
What I think is specificity, again, going back to the giraffes, like elite athletes, like they don't listen. Like people who quite often are coaching them, they're managing the talent. Like that's literally what they're doing. So they require very little introspection from themselves to exist in the sport. Like they're good at it. But if you want to do this is where you're going to have to take a moment, a get real moment with yourself and be like, all right, so what am I going to need in order to be successful at this? Generally speaking, when it comes to powerlifting, there's not a whole lot of other sports out there where muscle is it's that important. A lot of other sports, there's a point where you can get so jacked that it's just for yourself, and it might even downgrade your how successful you are at the sport. So muscle's important. They have weight classes. So for most people, it's okay, if you're not one of those giraffes, it's you're probably going to try to you need to maximize how much muscle you have on that frame. Along with that, I think there's a lot of things that you can learn from bodybuilders. Like for some powerlifters, dude, taking a cooking class might be your specificity. Go to Whole Foods and learn to work with the veggies and fruits. That might do you a lot of good, so that by the time the meat rolls around, we're not here in the same position we're always in, where we're trying to dump off 10 pounds in the last 6 weeks. So yeah, muscle, stay in, and having the skills to stay within your weight class, and that should be pliable over the course of the career because you're gaining muscle. For most people who aren't one of these exotic beasts, that's what your focus is going to have to be on. Then there's a skill component, and as I think we all can say this, as we've gotten older, we've gotten wiser with our time. We can do so much more in much less time because we're actually paying attention to what we're doing. right? So it literally baffled me that like I was able to get my squat back over 500 pounds with like 3 sets a week. But that's because I only had 3 sets a week. Whereas like whenever I was doing powerlifting specific stuff, I was just checking things off like the to-do list. And that's a very bad attitude when it comes to something technical. It's like you need to be there. You need to be present. Like it's study time. Like your warm-ups, you don't just blast through the warm-ups. You pay attention to what you're doing so that you could have a very good day. But in the long term, you can understand like how it's best for you to move, at least for now, because things change over time, right? Especially as you put on muscle. What's the best strategy to get there, basically? And it's important for you to be able to cut down like how much time you need to learn these things, because like Brian said, that's what's going to lead to longevity. That's what's going to make it so that, hey, especially in a sport where it's not about who gets there the fastest, you know, like it's more of a strength endurance sport. It's like you could do this for so long. And it's like relative. It's simple too from a technical standpoint. There's 3 things you're doing. Like you can do this for a long, long time. So yeah, learn to manage your weight for most people who are not those folks. Learn to make some time to put on muscle. And then over time, you do want to get sharper when it comes to your study time, which is your skill acquisition. It might not look like throwing darts, but it has a lot more, like to me, like anytime I've been strong at the power lifts, like I feel like when people tell me, damn, you're strong, dude, it's like I feel like I have more in common with the people who like rip open phone books or like do that with the frying pan than I do with a bodybuilder in a way. Because it's like learning about how to position yourself and get really, really good at that specific movement. So it's strength, right? But you don't feel strong like once you really get it. So yeah, minimize your study time, because unlike golf and other things, like we can't just be out there for fucking 8 hours. Like there's a recovery aspect to powerlifting. So yeah, for most people, that's going to be the general order. It's like, hey, get some muscle on you, learn to eat in a way that just it's going to enhance recovery, and then make it so that you don't like lose 10% of your strength every time you do a meet. And then pay attention when class is in order. Like that's literally how that's going to go. And the other people, the like 1% of the 1%, well, you know, fuck those guys because they don't listen anyways.
Well, this giraffe definitely agrees with all of those anecdotes and all those principles. And I can't help but feel that my coach is trying to tell me, stop trying to do this powerlifting meet in July, Eric. Just focus on bodybuilding. But we'll leave that for my next check-in in 4 days. So I think we've covered a lot of ground, gentlemen. I greatly appreciate your insights. We covered how specificity can be viewed as what's specific to the individual's needs right now and where they're at in their competition cycle and where they're at in much bigger picture. Are they a junior lifter or are they an M1 still trying to eke out more gains incrementally? We talked about how specificity is not just a thing, a broad principle that kind of has a cookie cutter template, but rather specificity is about the specific component of strength that you might want to enhance right now. And sometimes the specific act of doing the competition lift is not the best vehicle for it, considering just how important muscle mass is for a power lifter. We talked about varied practice and how that actually sits and coexists with specificity, and that many of the various programs out there, unintentionally or intentionally, leverage varied practice, probably to their advantage, and it's something you can do as well. And we talked about the quote-unquote stimulus to fatigue ratio, or the opportunity cost to doing some of these specific movements, and that you might be able to swap them out for something that has a little less cost in the long run and keeps you in the game for a longer time period. And we talked about just how low the actual dose is needed when you're using highly specific work to be effective, because specificity is king. And since specificity works so well, do you really need to do all of your volume with it? So with these lessons, we hope you can apply them to your training, get hurt less, get stronger sooner, and stay in the game longer, and decide whether it's worth being a giraffe trying to be a bulldog. And if you're like me, you'll stubbornly continue it and maybe have to get an occasional hip surgery. But if you're smart like Berto, you'll just win bodybuilding titles. So with that, we will sign out, and thank you very much for listening to this episode of the 3DMJ podcast.